December 6, 1944, the Arden Forest became a frozen altar of sacrifice. Amidst this carnage, a hidden war erupted between General Dwight Eisenhower and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. This is the story of a secret ultimatum that nearly shattered the Allied command, exposing the moment when the Supreme Commander prepared to invoke a court-martial against the British Empire's greatest hero. The winter of 1944 did not arrive with the promise of peace, but with the roar of a dying Reich. Under the cover of a massive, impenetrable fog, three German armies launched a desperate gambit that Adolf Hitler believed would split the Western Allies in two. It was called Operation Watch on the Rhine. As the first shells from heavy German railway guns screamed over the Belgian border, the Allied High Command remained blissfully unaware of the catastrophe unfolding in the snow. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in his headquarters at Versailles, celebrating the wedding of a subordinate, while 50 miles away the American line was being pulverized by the weight of 2,000 tanks and nearly 500,000 men. The initial reports were fragmentary and confused. Communication lines were severed by German commandos wearing American uniforms, and the fog grounded the tactical air forces that were the lifeblood of the Allied advance. By the time the scale of the disaster became clear, the German 5th Panzer Army and the 6th SS Panzer Division had punched a hole 50 miles wide through the thin American crust. The Bulge was forming, and with it, the unity of the Allied leadership began to fray at the seams. Eisenhower, a man known for his diplomatic patience and crusader spirit, suddenly found himself presiding over a collapsing front and a rising tide of resentment among his own generals. The geography of the battlefield dictated a radical command change. The German advance had sliced directly through General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, leaving him unable to effectively communicate with or supply his northern forces. Eisenhower made a pragmatic yet politically explosive decision. On the 20th of December, 1944, he telephoned Bradley and informed him that command of all American forces north of the breakthrough would be handed over to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. It was a move born of necessity, but for the American commanders who viewed Montgomery as arrogant and overly cautious, it was a bitter pill that tasted of defeat. Montgomery arrived at the American First Army headquarters like a conquering hero entering a liberated city. He did not come with words of consolation. He came with a swagger that suggested the Americans were incompetent children who needed a British nanny to save them. He strode into the war room, his signature double-badge beret pulled low, and immediately began criticizing the American dispositions. He spoke of tidying up the mess and reorganizing the front, phrases that cut deep into the pride of men like Courtney Hodges and George S. Patton. Montgomery believed that the Ardennes was proof that Eisenhower was unfit for ground command and that he, Montgomery, should be appointed as the sole commander of all Allied land forces. While Montgomery was consolidating his power in the north, the American soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division were surrounded and bleeding in the small crossroads town of Bastogne. The German 88mm guns were relentless, and the temperature dropped so low that the oil in the M4 Sherman tanks began to freeze. Eisenhower was under immense pressure from Washington and London. General George C. Marshal warned him that the American public would not tolerate a situation where British commanders took credit for American sacrifices. The political stakes were now as high as the military ones. By late December, the German momentum had begun to stall, not because of a grand British plan, but because of the sheer, stubborn grit of the American infantrymen. At Saint-Vith and Bastogne, the German schedule was shattered. Yet in his headquarters, Montgomery was drafting letters to London, claiming that he had saved the American First Army from total annihilation. He wrote to the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, stating that the Americans were falling back in a disorganized state and that the situation was very bad until he arrived to take charge. This narrative was a direct assault on the credibility of Eisenhower's leadership. The friction reached a boiling point in the final days of 1944. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was performing a miraculous 90-degree pivot to relieve Bastogne, was vocal in his disgust. Patton viewed Montgomery as a little tired man who was more interested in his own image than in killing Germans. The atmosphere at Schiff, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was toxic. Eisenhower was caught in the middle, trying to manage a coalition that was rapidly turning into a collection of warring tribes. He knew that the victory in the Ardennes would mean nothing if the commanders turned on each other before they reached the Rhine. Eisenhower's patience was not infinite. He had spent years acting as the glue for the alliance, often at the expense of his own health and reputation. But as January of 1945 dawned, Montgomery prepared to deliver the final insult. He requested a press conference to explain the victory in the Ardennes to the world. Eisenhower's staff warned against it, fearing that Montgomery would use the platform to aggrandize himself at the expense of the Americans, who had done 90% of the fighting and sustained nearly all the casualties. On the 7th of January 1945, Montgomery stood before a room full of international journalists. What followed was a masterclass in tone-deaf arrogance. He described the battle as one of the most interesting and tricky he had ever handled. He implied that the American soldiers were brave but lacked the generalship required for such a massive operation. He portrayed himself as the master puppeteer who had pulled the Americans out of the fire. When the news of this conference reached Bradley and Patton, the reaction was not merely anger. It was a total breakdown of trust. Omar Bradley, usually the most level-headed of men, flew to Eisenhower's headquarters in a state of white-hot rage. He told Eisenhower plainly that he would rather be relieved of command and sent home than serve another day under Montgomery. He argued that Montgomery's words were a slap in the face to every American family who had lost a son in the Ardennes. Patton went even further, suggesting that the Americans should simply stop the advance and let the British figure out how to win the war on their own. The alliance was at the edge of a precipice. Eisenhower finally realized that the diplomatic approach had failed. The nuclear option was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a necessity for the survival of the mission. He retreated to his private office and began to dictate a message to the combined chiefs of staff. This was not a request for mediation. It was a formal ultimatum. In the cold, precise language of a five-star general, Eisenhower laid out the case for Montgomery's removal. He argued that the field marshal's refusal to follow the chain of command and his public undermining of the supreme commander constituted a threat to the entire war effort. The draft letter was devastating. It stated that the situation had reached a point where the two men could no longer work together. Eisenhower was essentially telling the British government and the American president, "It is him or me." In the military world of 1945, for a subordinate to defy his commander in the middle of a major offensive was a grave offense. Eisenhower was prepared to invoke the full weight of military law, including the possibility of a court-martial, if Montgomery did not immediately and unconditionally submit to his authority. As the letter was being finalized, a heavy silence fell over SHAEF. The staff knew that if this message was sent, it would trigger a political earthquake in London. Winston Churchill would be forced to choose between his most famous general and the American commander who controlled the flow of men and material. It was a gamble that could have ended the war or prolonged it by years. But before the send button could be pressed, a single man decided to intervene. Major General Freddie de Guingen, Montgomery's own chief of staff, saw the draft and realized that his boss had walked into a trap of his own making. De Guingen was the bridge between the British and American worlds. He knew that Montgomery was technically brilliant, but socially disastrous. He realized that Eisenhower was not bluffing. Through a thick winter blizzard, de Guingen boarded a small plane and flew to Montgomery's headquarters. He arrived exhausted and freezing, carrying the weight of the entire alliance on his shoulders. He walked into Montgomery's office and laid the truth bare. He told the field marshal that he was about to be sacked and that no one in London, not even Churchill, would be able to save him. Montgomery was stunned. His ego had blinded him to the reality of the power dynamic. He truly believed he was indispensable. But as de Guingen described the white-hot rage at Eisenhower's headquarters and the draft letter waiting on the desk, the color drained from the field marshal's face. He realized that the supreme commander had finally found the limit of his patience. The nuclear option was armed and aimed directly at his career. For the first time in the war, the great Bernard Montgomery was silent. The atmosphere inside Montgomery's headquarters was stifling. The map tables were covered in the blue and red lines of the Ardennes front, but the real battle was happening in the silence between the field marshal and his chief of staff. De Guingen didn't hold back. He told Montgomery that Eisenhower had drafted a letter to the combined chiefs of staff that would effectively end his command. He explained that Bradley and Patton were ready to resign and that the Americans were done with British condescension. Montgomery, the man who had defeated Rommel at El Alamein, found himself backed into a corner by his own words. For several minutes, Montgomery said nothing. He stared at the reports from the front, where the British 30th Corps was finally engaging the German tip of the Bulge. He was a man of immense pride, a man who believed his tactical genius was the only thing standing between the Allies and a stalemate. But he was also a professional soldier. He understood the gravity of a him or me ultimatum from a supreme commander. If Eisenhower sent that letter, Montgomery would be recalled to London in disgrace, his reputation tarnished by the very arrogance he used as armor. Back at Versailles, Eisenhower was staring out the window at the gray winter sky. He had the letter in his hand. He was tired of the bickering. He was tired of the nationalistic pride that threatened to spill more blood than the Germans ever could. He knew that the American people were watching. The casualties in the Ardennes were nearing 80,000. To allow a subordinate general to mock that sacrifice for the sake of the headlines was a betrayal of every man in a foxhole. He was ready to sign. He was ready to end the career of the most popular man in Britain. Patton, meanwhile, was pushing his divisions through the frozen mud toward the Rhine. He didn't care about the politics. He cared about the momentum. But even Patton knew that a fractured command meant a slower victory. He had told Eisenhower that if Montgomery wasn't handled, the British would eventually try to take command of the entire American army. The nuclear option was not just about Montgomery's ego. It was about the sovereignty of the American military effort in Europe. The tension was a living thing, vibrating through every rank of the Allied expeditionary force. Under de Guingen's relentless pressure, Montgomery finally broke. He sat down at his desk and picked up a pen. He didn't write a defense. He didn't try to justify his press conference. At de Guingen's suggestion, he wrote a brief, almost humble note to Ike. He told Eisenhower that he was distressed to hear there was any feeling of resentment. He expressed his absolute loyalty to the Supreme Commander and promised to follow any order without question. It was a total, unconditional surrender of his ego to preserve his position. When the note reached Eisenhower, the tension in the room at Schaeff visibly evaporated. Eisenhower was not a vengeful man. He didn't want to destroy Montgomery. He wanted to control him. He saw the apology for what it was, a desperate attempt to stay in the game, and he accepted it. The nuclear option letter was placed into a secure file, never to be sent. The court-martial threat was withdrawn. But the relationship between the two men would never be the same. The trust was gone, replaced by a cold, professional necessity. In Washington, General George C. Marshall received a coded update. He was relieved that the crisis had passed without a public explosion, but he noted that Eisenhower had finally grown into his stars. The Supreme Commander had shown that he could be as ruthless as he was diplomatic. The Americans had asserted their dominance in the alliance, a shift in power that would dictate the final months of the war and the post-war order. The Ardennes was the last time the British would ever truly challenge American leadership on the Western Front. Winston Churchill, ever the master of rhetoric, eventually addressed the House of Commons to smooth over the damage. He called the Battle of the Bulge an American battle and praised the superb performance of the United States Army. He was trying to heal the wounds Montgomery had opened, but the scars remained. The British public never knew how close their favorite general had come to being sacked by an American. The secret of the nuclear option remained buried in the archives for decades, a testament to the fragile nature of coalitions. As the snow began to melt in the Ardennes, the cost of the battle became clear. Rows upon rows of white crosses began to fill the cemeteries at Henri-Chapelle and Margraten. These men hadn't died for the egos of generals. They had died to stop a monstrous regime. The leadership crisis at the top was a stark contrast to the unity found in the foxholes. To the American private freezing in the woods, it didn't matter who was in command, as long as the shells kept flying toward the German lines. The nuclear option was a reminder that even in the face of absolute evil, human vanity can still threaten the greatest of causes. The aftermath of the Montgomery-Eisenhower clash saw a change in the way the war was fought. Eisenhower became more assertive, and Montgomery became more isolated. The race to the Rhine and eventually the heart of Germany was marked by a competitive tension that pushed the armies forward, but also led to strategic disagreements. Montgomery still wanted a single thrust under his command, but Eisenhower was now firm in his broad front strategy. The field marshal had lost his leverage the moment he forced Eisenhower to reach for the nuclear option. Years later, historians would debate whether Eisenhower should have followed through with the sacking. Some argue that removing Montgomery would have cleared the way for a faster, more unified end to the war. Others believe it would have caused a political rift so deep that the Soviets might have reached the English Channel. What is certain is that the threat of the court-martial was the only language Montgomery truly understood. It was the moment the chairman of the board became the commander-in-chief. Eisenhower's five-star insignia was more than just rank. It was a symbol of the immense weight he carried. The nuclear option was the ultimate tool in his arsenal, a weapon he hoped never to use, but one he was prepared to deploy to ensure that the mission, the liberation of Europe, remained the only priority. He had faced down the arrogance of his own side just as surely as he had faced down the desperation of the enemy. The final victory in Europe would come in May of 1945, but the seeds of that victory were protected in the dark days of January. By standing his ground against Montgomery, Eisenhower ensured that the Allied command remained a single, cohesive force. The crossing of the Rhine and the encirclement of the Ruhr were the fruits of a command structure that had survived its greatest internal test. The liberation of Europe was a tapestry of millions of individual stories, but the thread that held it all together was the resolve of the man at the top. Eisenhower's decision to draft that letter was perhaps the most courageous act of his career, not because it required physical bravery, but because it required the moral courage to risk everything for the sake of the chain of command. As the sun sets over the peaceful woods of the Ardennes today, the silence is a far cry from the thunder of 1944. The monuments stand as a tribute to the soldiers, but the history books hold the lesson of the leaders. In the end, the alliance survived because one man knew how to lead, and the other finally learned how to follow. The nuclear option remained a secret, a ghost in the machine of history, proving that the greatest battles are sometimes fought not with tanks, but with a single sheet of paper and the will to use it. If Eisenhower had actually sent a letter and removed Montgomery from command, how do you believe the British government and public would have reacted? And would the Allied alliance have survived the fallout? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.